Good morning. All right, we have a passage in James to read, and if you'd like to turn there, you can peruse it with your own eye according to your own version. I will have it up on the screen as well, if you prefer it that way, and you can see long distances. James 4:13 through 17 goes like this. Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogant schemes. All such boasting is evil. If anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. In many ways, whoa, all kinds of things are happening. Okay. In many ways, this passage, I think, is very, very clear. It is straightforward in what it is telling us to avoid and straightforward in what it's telling us to do. In other ways, perhaps you've noticed this as well, James is a unique writer among New Testament writers in that sometimes he says things that are a little bit challenging to understand exactly how one thing applies to the verse before it. The progression can sometimes be a little challenging. So I think the first few verses are pretty clear. First of all, I don't think he's talking only to people who talk about their future plans involving the making of money or the moving to a different city to expand a business. I think he's using this as an example for all of us who, as humans, project into the future our own anticipation of what we'd like to see and what we'd like to have happen in a perfect scenario for ourselves. So this part I think is clear. I want to focus in on verse 14. Why, you do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. This got my mind thinking about some different connections within Scripture that I'll walk you through here. So Job 7, Psalm 90, Psalm 103, and Luke 12. So we've got really ancient Old Testament passages. We've got poetry and hymns to God in the Psalms, and then we have Jesus' own teaching, all reinforcing this same idea about our life being a mist that is just here for a little while and then vanishes. So Job 7:7 says, remember, O God, that my life is but a breath. That concept of your life being extremely brief, as short, hyperbolically comparing it to one single breath, and it's gone. Psalm 90, the whole psalm is actually great to read for all the ideas that it contains that connect to this one particular idea of your life being very short. And it actually connects to some other parts of the James passage as well, the idea of committing your ways to the Lord. But here's a couple key verses that I think reinforce this idea. Before the mountains were born, verse 2 of Psalm 90, before the mountains were born, or you brought forth the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Interesting contrast here. Humans are but a breath, a mere vapor that appears and is gone, passes away. Before everlasting and to everlasting, God is. You are God. I've always enjoyed the present tense to be verb, that second to last word there, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Ever present, as far back as you can look and as far forward. So we have a good contrast there that I think is going to connect to the later stuff that James says in his passage. Moving on in Psalm 90 to verses 4 through 6. For 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. You sweep men away in the sleep of death. They're like the new grass of the morning. Though in the morning it springs up new, by evening it is dry and withered. Verse 10 says, the length of our days is 70 years, or 80, if we have the strength. Verse 17 says, may the favor of the Lord our God rest upon us. Establish the work of our hands for us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. It would be interesting to just spend a week comparing Psalm 90 to the passage in James that we're reading, because there's so many similarities there. The reminder that our life is short and fleeting, the reminder that God is the one that's in charge of the future, not us, and the idea of committing your ways to the Lord and asking for him to establish what he would have you do. There's two more that I'd like to look at. Psalm 103 is also a nice companion to James 4. Verse 15 and 16 of Psalm 103 read, as for man, his days are like grass. He flourishes like a flower of the field. The wind blows over it, and it's gone, and its place remembers it no more. This is clearly an image that biblical writers have been using for a long time that is very familiar by the time we read it in the New Testament with James. I wanted to look at one of Jesus' parables, commonly called the parable of the rich fool. He didn't give it a particular name, at least in the account that we have, but I think that's a pretty good encapsulation of what he's trying to point out. So Jesus is teaching the people. And in verse 15 of chapter 12 of Luke, Jesus said to them, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. And he told them this parable. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. In this story from Jesus, we have something so relatable, the idea that it's very tempting for us to see our future security in terms of how much stuff we can amass. And it would seem that those of us who James is speaking to, who say today or tomorrow we'll go into this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business and make money, well, that's a way of laying up for yourself future security. And that's a very familiar way of basing our future security. It's a very familiar thing to most of us. What does James tell us to do rather than that? He says, instead you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. What does this tell us? By saying it's the Lord's will what happens to us tomorrow, years in the future, in the next moment, it acknowledges that God's in ultimate control of our days. We're being reminded, despite whatever plans we may make, it's really the Lord who will determine whether they happen or not. It encourages us to submit our plans to God and ask for his will and his guidance. Rather than asking God to come along and give us whatever we have planned, what a better thing to say, Lord, what do you have planned? What would you like me to be a part of? I don't think that James is giving us an injunction against planning for the future or being careful or making sure that we have prepared or laid aside provisions for the next day or for our family or provided for our home or made a strategic plan for our business, or set in motion some projected steps for our church. I don't think that this is an injunction against making plans. I don't think it's an injunction against expanding a business. I don't think God is saying, you've got to keep your business small and whatever growth it has will just be a surprise from me. I think, again, it's about an attitude. It's a guiding principle that your plans may evaporate in the next moment, whereas God's plans are the ones that will last for eternity. And so aligning ourselves with his plan is always the way to go. A key seems to be in verse 16, where James says, as it is, you boast and brag. All such boasting is evil. There's a boastfulness. There's a imbalance of values when we assume that whatever we have planned for tomorrow or for next year or for next week or the next decade or our golden years or what have you, when we assume that those things are all going to fall in place because we have made those plans. The teaching seems to be against an attitude of self-reliance without God and boasting as though one's future is a sure thing. There's a tradition at Woodstock that I noticed and then I started picking up without even really trying to. And there are a number of people who use the phrase, Lord willing, whenever they refer to future plans. We'll see you next Wednesday, we sometimes say at our Wednesday group, Lord willing. Or, thanks for the text. That sounds like a good idea. I'll see you Saturday, Lord willing. And sometimes I chuckle when I say it as well, but I think there's some real value to this habit. It could be a mindless tradition, just like other traditions that we do without examining it. But it can be helpful to remember as you go out to the grocery store. Okay, I'll be back in an hour. Well, I actually don't know if I'll be back in an hour, right? I'm heading to work, right? And I'm thinking about what's going to happen in my day and what I need to teach first period and who I'm going to see and what paperwork I need to get together. And I really don't know if I'm going to make it there or not. I could have a flat tire. I could get stopped for some other reason. I could slide off the road, or the Lord could have different plans for me, right? So it is an interesting thing to start weaving that idea of reminding yourself at every moment when you think about the future, well, if it's the Lord's will, that'll happen. Okay, I want to look at verse 17. It says, anyone then who knows the good he ought to do and doesn't do it sins. And I struggled with this for a bit as I was thinking about this passage, trying to understand how it fit in. Because it starts with the phrase, anyone then, but it didn't seem to exactly flow with what came before it. He's telling us to be careful not to boast and brag, to say if it's the Lord's will, we'll live and do this or that. What does this have to do with doing the good that we ought to do and not overlooking it? Here are some thoughts. I think as we look through James as a whole, there is this repeated idea that obedience always trumps mere talk. And here are a few places where he makes this point. In chapter 1, verse 22, he says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. In verse 25 of chapter 1, he says, but the man who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he's heard, but doing it, he will be blessed in what he does. In verse 26 of chapter 1, if anyone considers himself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on his tongue, he deceives himself and his religion is worthless. Just to tie this in with the same idea, it's not about how religious you consider yourself. It's not about your own impression of your godliness or how flashy your status is as a Christian. It is about what you do. If you are not reining your tongue, you are not doing what the Lord is commanding. Chapter 2, verse 17, in the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. So we have this real theme throughout James of it's not what you say, it's not what you necessarily even think of yourself, it's what you do. Action is required. Chapter 4, verse 11 says, brothers do not slander one another. Anyone who speaks against his brother or judges him speaks against the law and judges it. When you judge the law, you are not keeping it, but sitting in judgment on it. Okay, so there's this Jamesian theme of doing what you're supposed to do rather than just talking about it. So in this way, when we understand that theme, even though it may seem like it's disconnected, verse 17 with the rest of that passage, I think it has a recognizable, repeated message. And that message is, don't forget who you are and who God is. Don't start thinking that you're in charge of the show. Don't start thinking that you are saved by your own perception of your own goodness. Don't start thinking that you've done more than you've actually done just because you've listened a lot or read a lot. Don't slacken. Don't fake it. Don't backslide. God demands our obedience, and he will never be placated by lip service. A couple passages to remind us of this idea of lip service being ultimately fruitless. God is in heaven. This is Ecclesiastes 5:2. God is in heaven and you are on earth, so let your words be few. Don't forget who you are. God's supreme. God is mighty. God is all-knowing. God is from everlasting to everlasting. You are a mere vapor that appears for a moment. Be careful what you say. Matthew 15:7-8, Jesus, quoting Isaiah, says, "You hypocrites, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you. These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." The idea of just merely saying the right thing throughout Scripture is shown as being incomplete. It is not the obedience that God is looking for. And so verse 17, to wrap this 17 discussion up, James seems to be saying, now that we've discussed putting future plans in God's hands and how you need to remember to do that, you got to do it. It's not negotiable. We would be very deceived if we were to read any part of James and go, yeah, I think I understand what James is saying, and then wrap it up and go on our way as we have been going. We need to make a change. Here is the change that I think could be helpful. And this kind of related to, this relates to a couple of situations that I find myself in a lot. I mentioned being on the way to work, and my mind is very occupied with what's coming next. Of course, it's important to project into the future a little bit so that you know what you're doing, so that you have a plan. But I have to remember that it is frequently frustrating to me when I get to work and I have a plan and I've got my handouts and I've got my lesson plan and I've got my groups of students made in advance. And as soon as we begin class, something will come up that I'm not expecting. This may be hard to believe, but some people don't come on time and they don't get all my instructions. Sometimes people come and they haven't been there for a couple days and they need to be caught up. Sometimes people, this is even more hard to believe, aren't very interested in what I have planned. And it's mind-boggling, but it doesn't go the way that I expect. And my job is to react to the situation that I have in those moments. I can be very frustrated if I see those all as things that are just wrenches thrown into my fine-tuned machine. Another example would be like a Friday night, maybe the end of a work week, where I'm thinking, awesome, I'm done. I'm going to go home. I'm going to make some coffee. I'm going to play some music. I'm going to watch something entertaining on TV. I'm going to put my sweatpants on, right? Whatever it is, you fill in the blank. It's Friday. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. It is going to be glorious because it's the weekend. I was thinking this week, how do I apply this to my life? How do I, because I'm not planning on moving to a different city and making money. James isn't talking to me. Well, I think he is talking to me. And it was helpful for me to think about this week. Lord, I don't know what's going to happen tonight when I get home. It is Friday night. I've got my plan for what a perfect Friday night looks like. But what will come up? What do you want me to do? What will someone else in my family need? Am I going to react to that as an obstacle that's been an unfair wrench that's been thrown into my plans, or am I going to view it as something that God's bringing me, that he wants to use me to do? Um, just two more little texts from the Bible that I think speak to this idea. Psalm 37:4 says, "Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." If we can align ourselves with the Lord, and I don't think we always know exactly what the Lord wants us to do an hour from now. I think this is the idea is we need to leave ourselves open to what God wants to do with us in an hour. A conversation that somebody will want to have with us, a need that someone will express that we can meet, a challenge that we're not anticipating that needs to be dealt with, but not grudgingly or with complaining or with frustration, but with thankfulness and with the awareness that God is in charge and God will equip us to do what he wants us to do. So we delight ourselves in the Lord and say, Lord, whatever you have for me in the future is great. I will get on board with that, and I'll do it to the best of my ability. I feel like that's aligning yourself with him, and then your desires become like his desires, and you get the desires of your heart because your heart desires what the Lord's heart desires. Proverbs 16:3 says, "Commit yourself to the Lord, whatever you do, and your plans will succeed." So my prayer for you and my prayer for myself is that God will begin to show us this more and more, that we can practice this. We can make a habit. We can practice this reflex of catching ourselves when we're planning for the future to make sure and include God in that and ask him what he would like us to do and help us watch for what he wants to bring into those future moments and respond to him, respond to the things that come up in his power.
Take what